conversation today is aimed at people who've been made redundant in the recent past who are looking for a new job. Perhaps they haven't written a CV for a number of years. So, Graeme, I'm going to put myself in the spot here.
Uh-huh.
I haven't written a CV for at least 10 years. What is the optimum length of a CV, may I ask?
Yeah, it's a situation a lot of my clients are in. They've not needed a CV because they've gone from one job to another on recommendations, or they've moved up in the same company, and that's all a really good thing. So there was a traditional view that a CV should always be 2 pages, and I think it's not really a set in stone rule anymore. I wouldn't necessarily say it has to be that, but 2 pages is a good guide for something which it can be compelling and it can be detailed enough to get you selected. My absolute maximum for a CV would be 3 pages, but you really have to be able to justify the third page. So ideally, it's not just more and more work experience. You're best off summarizing your work experience and distilling the key points and the key achievements in particular. But an example of someone who might need a third page on the CV would be an academic. So I often write CVs for academics where it's a 2 page career history, but then the third page would be a list of the publications or conferences that they've presented at. I mean, in one case, somebody had published 100 articles and book chapters, and that just absolutely had to be on a third page because that's highly relevant information. And maybe if you're in a creative industry, you might want to have a portfolio on the third page. I did one for an architect recently, and there was project examples, really briefly, what I did, what I achieved, and that kind of thing on the third page. So yeah, 3 if you can justify, but you should always be aiming otherwise to get your CV out in 2 pages. 1 if you're very early career, 1 if you're in the US and Canada, or you're applying for jobs in the USA, Canada. But I have to say, actually, I've written plenty of 2 page CVs for the US and Canada, and they've worked. They've got people selected for interview. So, in summary, no absolute rules, but 2 pages is a good guide, and 3 pages absolute maximum.
Very good. That's a very interesting article. I always understood it to be 2 pages, but as you say, a third page can be beneficial if you are a person who's academic and you're going to apply for a professorship at a university, for example.
Yeah,
You have to approve your publications and show them to be authentic. The same as an
absolutely.
architect who wants to show a list of clients they've developed or designed houses for, or designed office blocks for, or office towers, whatever the case may be. Yeah, so you're proving your credentials as a professional
Yeah.
person in that instance. Moving the conversation along, and I think the world has changed an awful lot in terms of data privacy, particularly in the last number of years where we have GDPR regulations. So, a question for you: should a person put their home address on a CV?
It's not really necessary. You wouldn't expect it to do any harm because your CV has a very limited audience. It's only going to a very small number of people who are shortlisting for a particular job. So it's not the riskiest thing you can possibly do. Putting your details on social media is far more risky. But your full address really doesn't need to be on your CV. And I think it goes back to first principles. What's the purpose of a CV? The purpose of my CV is to get me selected. So anything that helps to get me selected belongs on there. And if it doesn't belong on there. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is you don't want to be given recruiters something that they can judge you on that isn't relevant. And that obviously applies to a lot of things. But you often hear recruiters saying things like, oh, well, this person's nearer, or that person would have to commute further, etc. And that's really none of their business, okay?
Yeah.
How far I'm willing, my first job, I used to get 2 buses and a train, how far I'm willing to commute is a personal thing. So and I might be able to do it without any problem. So yeah, don't give them anything that they're going to try to judge you on that isn't particularly relevant. But if you want to put a city or a town as a kind of general location, that can work. But you might be relocating for the job, mightn't you? So
Of course.
yeah, let's just keep it focused. Your contact details that you need on your CV are your phone number and your email address, so that they can contact you and invite you for the interview. Anything else they can collect later on.
Very good. What about putting your age on a CV?
Don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, again, it's about people judging you on the wrong criteria. As soon as you disclose something, humans can't really forget it. They can't really unfocus on it. There's really absolutely no good reason to have your age on CV. Obviously, once they've employed you, they're going to collect your date of birth and all the other contact details for the tax forms and things like that for the payroll. But absolutely don't put. So I've seen lots of things on CVs that don't belong there. So age, marital status. Of course, marital status affects your tax, but as I said, they can collect that stuff later.
Of course.
Yeah, ages of children, even names of children I've seen on CVs. And again, there are cultural differences as well. So in some parts of the world, they have very formal CVs with a lot of detail on, I've even seen father's occupation on some, but that's, the days of that mattering to people are coming to an end, and I would encourage everybody not to do that in order to move towards a more objective. I mean, humans are not objective, right? Humans think with their emotions, not with their logical processes. But we've got to try our best. A CV and an interview are the least bad options for recruiting and selecting people. So we've just got to make the best of this really imperfect system and go from there. So compelling reasons to choose you. That's what you want on your CV.
Okay. And the last question in that regard is, should a person put their nationality on a CV when you consider, for example, that London is such a cosmopolitan city and is trying to encourage people to emigrate into the UK to work, for example, in financial services from all over the world? So is it a good point to say, I'm British, French, German, to put your nationality on your CV?
No, I would say not, John, because if that's relevant for a particular reason, you'll have said it anyway. So if you want to say, right, I'm applying to a company that does a lot of work in the French market, the relevant point is that I've worked in the French market before. I've worked with clients in this region or that region. So you're going to say that in your summary anyway. You're going to say that further on in your CV, but your actual nationality is far less relevant. Again, it comes back to not allowing people to judge you on the wrong criteria. Obviously, we've got to prevent discrimination. We've got to try to prevent discrimination, and we've got to each understand that we are capable of making judgments that are not particularly rational or objective. But no, I can't see any valid reason for putting personal details like that on. Again, if they'll get the data they need once they've employed you, but also if it's for something such as work permit status, then maybe you reassure them about that somewhere else.
Yeah, of course.
I don't like putting things on cover letters that aren't on CVs, because this might come as a surprise to some people, but lots of recruiters don't read cover letters. As shocking as that is, and I do think it's rude, actually, if you ask for something and then don't read it and consider it, because if you ask me for a cover letter, I'm going to take it that that's part of the recruitment process, and I'm going to put my best effort into it. So a cover letter should always be just a summary of what's on your CV, and ideally nothing extra. But you might want to reassure them that you've got the ability to work in the country that you're applying to. You've got, whatever status you need, visas, whatever, or nationality, or whatever the thing might be. But just to state your nationality, I don't see is of particular use.
Okay, so moving the conversation along here, Graeme, now we're into the work experience section. Should a person start with their most recent job on their CV?
That's the traditional way of doing it. That would be typical. The vast majority of CVs do begin like that. I would say, like all good questions, the answer is it depends. So always think, and I've said it once at least already, always think the purpose of this CV is to get me selected. Does my recent job help me get selected? And is that the most important information I've got? If that's the case, absolutely. But, you know, you might be seeking a career change and you might want to be moving into a different role. And maybe you did that role 10 years ago. Now, that experience is perfectly valid, in my opinion. So you might want to emphasize that. That leads on to not only doing your CV in a different order, but actually, you might want to do it differently out altogether. You might want to have a skills section at the top, which I don't always recommend. But if the person spec recommends 6 skills that they're looking for, I would do a section on each of those 6 skills. I wouldn't do that if there are 20 of them, mind.
Of course.
But if there were a small discrete number of skills and they're not repetitious as well, which is one of the problems you often see on person specs and job descriptions, they kind of say the same thing in 6 different ways. So you really don't want to be saying it 6 times. But yeah, if there's a small number, put it on there. Maybe your employment section. I think you're always going to have a list of jobs. Maybe that comes further down and it's a lot more succinct. So yeah, absolutely no. The key thing about writing your CV is do whatever gets you selected. So the content you put on your CV, it has to be true. It has to be relevant to the person spec, and don't make any rash decisions on what's relevant and what isn't. It has to be true. It has to be relevant to the person spec, and it has to be positive about you. Okay. It's not your job to tell people anything negative. If they want to ask you, have you ever done this or that? They can ask you. Hopefully you haven't got anything negative to tell them. But it's not your job to say, I'm average at this software and I've never used this particular tool before. And, I've only done this a few times. It's your job to tell them what you're capable of, why you should be selected, and you should do that in whatever way is most powerful for you. Ultimately, what you need to be doing is binning the rules. So don't get distracted by so-and-so on the internet says that these are the rules about CV writing. Okay. You've got to write what works for you.
So the next question then, in terms of CV presentation or preparation, is in terms of a job, should you outline your most important accomplishments in that job, or do you outline the duties you had in that job on your CV?
Always accomplishments are the most important. I would almost not put tasks at all, because if you identify all of the accomplishments you've had in your current job and then pick the most important ones, I generally see no more than 6 bullet points in any section, okay? Because if you've got more than 6 points, you probably need more than one section. And I'm not sure anybody's reading points 7, 8, 9, 10,
Yeah, of course.
So you're going to outline your key achievements. In doing so, you're probably going to demonstrate the tasks. I increased revenue from X million to Y million, okay? So you don't then need to say, I was responsible for revenue generation. And if you say, I managed XYZ project, which came in, I know it's a horrible cliche, on time and on budget, or I managed a project which achieved XYZ, you don't then have to say, I was responsible for project management, So you might do a couple of lines at the beginning about your responsibilities, and then you really just list your achievements. The problem with listing tasks is the tasks you were responsible for in your job are the same as everyone else's who's in the same job. So it's not going to differentiate you. It's not going to get you selected. So take a lot of that stuff can be taken as a given and just focus entirely or almost entirely on the achievements.
What if a person has a gap on their CV? How can they get around that to make themselves look a positive, good candidate for a job?
Yeah, I don't like this terminology, gap on the CV, because you didn't have a gap in your life, did you?
True.
You are probably doing something relevant, or you are doing something which is none of the employer's business, and that's a controversial thing to say, because a lot of employers think that it's their job to really delve into everything that someone's ever done, and agencies, in particular recruitment agencies, will literally go through a CV and actively look for gaps. Now, for that reason, in an ideal world, you would account for all of the time in the time frame that you're covering on your CV, right? Because if you've got a 40-year career, you might only be going into detail in the last 10 or 20 years, and then you might be doing one-liners about previous jobs. So, well, that's the first option, okay? So there are numerous ways of dealing with so-called gaps. The first option, if it was a long time ago, is just to detail the recent experience and do very brief overviews of what you did previously. Another method is the most common one, really. As I said, you didn't have a gap in your life. Pick something that you did in that time and detail that. So your options there are numerous. It could be, I was training, right? I did some online learning to support my career transition, and I achieved this, this, and this. It might be voluntary work. Voluntary work is just as valid as anything else. Whether you are paid or not is nobody's business. And whether you are paid or not makes no difference to whether or not you've developed skills and achieved things and showcased all of the things the employer's looking for. So that's another option. I mean, it might be, obviously, a common so-called gap is looking after children. Now, I know for a fact that looking after children is harder than any job anyone's ever had, okay? So just put that on your CV if you want to, and if that's the reason you weren't in paid employment, you can literally just put 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, looking after children, and any employer who takes a dim view of that, hasn't kept up with the world, and I would suggest probably isn't the best person to work for anyway. So find the positives.
True.
You were doing something. I mean, if you weren't working for health reasons, there are cases where I've just written that for people, because you're allowed to not be 100% healthy and well all of the time. And you might also augment that with training courses that you've done recently.
True.
Whatever work you've done. But yeah, ultimately what you need to do is find positive things to put on your CV for all of the time frame that you're covering. And you've got to try to do that. If there really isn't anything positive that you can put there, it is okay to leave a gap, but you really have to be prepared to be asked about it at interviews or at the first screening call that they do when they contact you. But yeah, you didn't have a gap in your life ultimately.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying there is, if a person had a 40-year career, there's no need to talk about the 40-year career in detail. Talk about the most recent experience. So, for example, if you're a chartered accountant who's applying to become finance director in XYZ PLC, people don't want to hear about what you did as a trainee accountant many years ago. They want to know about your most recent experience as a financial controller or finance manager or commercial manager, for example. And then they put you on that experience. And that's going to be the most important criteria in determining whether you get an interview for the FT's role or not. So I think
absolutely
in what you're talking about, and keep it relevant to the job in question that you're applying for. Yeah, and also don't give any negative connotation about yourself. If you have been out ill, for example, for a couple of years and you had to step away from the workplace, by all means, put that on your CV. There's nothing wrong in doing that. It just
Yeah.
helps you to explain a situation that might be a bit tricky otherwise. So they're all
Yeah,
right.
actually, I know some people who sold a company and didn't need to work for a couple of years. They went off traveling, and
Yeah,
the question you get then in interviews is, "What motivates you to come and work for me?" kind of thing. And sometimes people do that. So there are all kinds of scenarios. But yeah, that's absolutely right. But as you say, John, the level of the accomplishment has to be relevant to the job. So if you're applying for a director level role, it has to be director level accomplishment. So it's likely to be strategic decision making, strategic change, a development of people, growing a business, managing major initiatives, mergers, acquisitions, you
of
know,
course.
director level roles require director level accomplishments, and mid management roles require you to showcase that you were an effective mid manager who was starting to take on strategic responsibilities and is ready to step up because you've been acting in that role for the last X number of years anyway. Do you know what I mean?
Of course. So just moving the conversation along here, Graeme. And the next section I can think of, and it's many years since I wrote a CV, by the way, is the education section, I should say, on your CV. Now, if a person is a member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants or the Institute of Marketing, for example, do you have to put down on your CV that you got X number of A levels or GCSEs? Is it just talk about your most highest, I suppose you could say your highest or most professional qualifications? That's sufficient on your CV.
Yeah, I think so. It's another one of those things, isn't it, where it depends who you are, it depends what you're aiming to do next, and all of those things. But I do think if you've got a level 7 qualification in something, you don't necessarily need to talk about GCSEs and A levels. I mean, if you got 3 years at A levels and got into Oxford or Cambridge, then you may want to state that. I don't think we need to know what subjects you did, unless it's hugely relevant. But you're going to tailor that section to what's required for the job. And again, the job might say must have a degree or equivalent experience, and you might have both. So you might detail your equivalent experience, but you might say, I've got a degree in this. I've also got a chartered accountant qualification or marketing or whatever it is. Yeah, there's absolutely no requirement to detail your secondary education if it was just, general. And if it was like me and it was kind of average results,
Yeah.
and you've done other things since, yeah, it's a complete inefficient use of space, isn't it? So yeah, just whatever makes you a professional at what you do is what goes on.
Very good point. And in terms of professional qualifications, whether it's accountancy, marketing, law, for example, where people are required to do continuing professional development, should you put down details of the most pertinent CPD you've done the last couple of years on a job or CV, I should say?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think CPD is useful to demonstrate that you're keeping up to date with things. And I know a lot of the chartered societies do require you to do CPD. In some cases, the job that you're doing might suffice to meet those qualifications, depending on what you're doing. But I always think the same rule applies. I don't like rules, but the same principle applies. If you've done some CPD, which is hugely relevant, like, I don't know, in my case, I'm a chartered marketer. I've recently been reading about the use of psychology in branding, and how vital that is to improving our communications.
Very good.
I would probably put that on. But it depends, it depends whether you've showcased those skills already. But if it's highly relevant to what you're doing, I would suggest that it's worth putting on. But again, it's a one-liner. It's not huge detail about it. But yeah, CPD, it's part of the mix, isn't it? You're building a story about why you should be chosen based on your experience, your skills, your natural abilities. You know, we're all competent at certain things and find it easier to develop. You know, we've all got certain personality types. You might find a way of including that. It's experience, it's qualifications, it's achievements. You're building a picture based on all of these different things, and you're just selecting whichever suits you for the particular job.
Yeah, I think also with CV preparation, there's an inherent danger. For example, if you're applying to be a mid-level manager and you put down, for example, CPD is all geared towards technical aspects of accountancy or marketing, for example, the employer is going to get the impression perhaps this person is ignoring developing their people skills, and that could be a red flag against you in terms of getting an interview for a job. So I think it's a case of making sure that the CPD is balanced, that it's not too lopsided in preference, say, to technical skills as against people skills, which are probably more important in middle to senior management roles. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. You might demonstrate the people skills in a different section if you haven't been formally trained in them. And yeah, you might avoid doing too much operational level detail and technical skills, because to be fair, they might take that as a given anyway. It's a shame how many job descriptions and person specs still must be familiar with Microsoft Office on, you know, because then you feel obliged because it's on the person spec to actually list it on your CV, which is a bit of a waste of space, really, because everybody's either used it or has the ability to learn it. But you made me think there in what you were saying. There is the question of relevance. And as I said before, people shouldn't make rash decisions on what's irrelevant and what's not. So let's take, for example, someone has a degree in law, okay? They might be applying for a job that has nothing to do with law, doesn't require that qualification, but that qualification says something about who they are. You know, it says that they've got some commercial skills, they know how contracts work and how relationships between different stakeholders work. It says that they can research at a high level. It says that they're very accurate and, you know, a really logical thinker. And you might decide that that's relevant just for those reasons, rather than is it on the person spec directly? Because I'm a big believer in building a personal brand, and what you're qualified in might be relevant to that. For example, a science degree shows a particular way of thinking, you know, and they are both examples of things that might not be directly asked for on the person spec, but you might determine that they demonstrate some other skills kind of indirectly.
Of course. And if a person is, for example, qualified as an engineer or scientist, as you just mentioned there a second or two ago, Graeme, I think if you're applying for general management roles, perhaps it would be beneficial to have that MBA and mention that on your CV, because you might give the impression to the employer that you have all these, you know, technical qualifications, engineering or science, but where is the general management skill set to support your application for a GM role? So I think it's a case of being pertinent but realistic about your qualifications and making sure that you don't overstate your skill set on one hand, and on the other hand, undersell yourself. That's a grave danger also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about interests and hobbies, may I ask? Because let's say you're applying for a role as a marketing director.
Yeah.
And you have to be given the impression that you're the extrovert because you have to get out there and deal with buyers in other organizations. You've got to be able to push people's boundaries and negotiate from a strong position. If you have hobbies or interests that, like, say, reading, rugby union, football, hill walking, you might think this guy just plays it too safe in terms of their hobbies. Would it be better to say, I sailed the Atlantic, I'm a mountain climber? If it's true, you know, that you give the impression that this person can take a risk, but they can manage that risk effectively in a situation.
Yeah, I think, like you said, you've got to decide, why am I saying this? Okay, so if I list this particular hobby or this particular interest, why am I choosing to convey that? By the way, you can easily miss off the hobbies and interests section from your CV entirely, and it's not going to stop you from being selected. So it's the kind of section that I would always include in a very early career CV, okay, because you really should be at that stage having outside interests that are
True.
demonstrating something relevant. Okay, for example, the number of people who in their early career will just write hobbies judo, and I'll say to them, okay, just speculatively, I'll say, because I'm a good interviewer, what have you achieved in your judo? Oh, I'm a black belt. Hang on, why doesn't it say that you're a black belt on your CV? Oh, I'm a national champion. Hang on, the fact that you do this sport or that sport isn't what gets you selected, right? The fact that you've achieved something at that level is what gets you selected. So you didn't become a national champion overnight, okay? You worked hard at it over a protracted period of time. You demonstrated perseverance, resilience, commitment. All of those are the general skills that all employers are looking for. So having achieved something in sport, art, music, whatever it is, brilliant way of demonstrating those skills. So the first thing is review your hobbies and interests to determine whether or not you've achieved something that's important in those things. And as you say, hill walking, mountain climbing, things that demonstrate a kind of active personality, risk-taking ability to, get outside your comfort zone. I think as long as you're not worrying people that, it comes back to people judging you on the wrong criteria, but I don't see any reason why you wouldn't do that if it was relevant. You've got to demonstrate that you're a well-rounded, interesting person. Caring about your own well-being is a perfectly valid thing as well, because you're going to bring a more able kind of self to the role. I think reading is an interesting one because anybody can say that. I think the more interesting thing is reading what, are you like a local history expert, or do you read business books? I know we don't want the CV to be too dry, but maybe you do keep up to date with the recent thinking in your field, or you have something which is tangentially related, so you might be a specialist in one field, but you keep up to date with business thinking generally. Or I don't know, these days it would be, I'm a marketer, but I'm keenly following developments in AI because it's going to transform the industry, perhaps,
Yeah.
So I'm in danger of repeating myself, but it comes back to finding ways of making it relevant again. So not just what have I done, but what have I achieved, which demonstrates my suitability for this role.
Next question I have in mind here is referees. Should you mention referees on a CV?
No. That's a straightforward one for me, John, because there's really no need to. It's a huge waste of space to give all of their contact details. I think with GDPR as well, you might have their permission to pass the details on to the employer, but you don't necessarily want to be including it in every job application that you make. I mean, hopefully you're not making too many, by the way, because if you're making lots of job applications and not getting shortlisted, that's the first sign that you need to change something about the way you're communicating. But no, there's no good reason whatsoever to put references on your CV unless the employer says in the advert, you must include references on your CV, because obviously not following their instructions is a great way of getting ruled out just at first glance, and I've seen some classic examples of that in my time. People refusing to fill a form in or whatever. Don't ever write "please see attached CV," because it just marks you out as someone who doesn't want or doesn't believe they need to follow the process.
Yeah.
they can get the references later. You know what I mean? I don't, in the ones I write, I don't even write references available on request either, because employers know they can ask for references. You know, they don't really need to be told that they can do that, because they're either going to ask for them or they're not, you know. So you haven't got space on your CV for kind of generic, pointless lines like that.
Yeah. Just going back to the job experience section of the CV, and people talk about, say, their achievements in their most recent job or over the last, say, 10, 15 years in various jobs. How important is it to give the impression that you're a collaborative person, as against somebody who might give the impression they're a one-man band, for example?
It depends, because there are some jobs in which working on your own is the key requirement. So if that's the case, I wouldn't be banging on about collaborating with this and collaborating with that. But in most jobs, collaboration is very important, absolutely. And there are various ways of demonstrating that internally, externally, with other stakeholders. So if as long as working on your own isn't stated as a key requirement, or obviously you can infer that it's a key requirement, then yeah, ability to collaborate is never going to do any harm. You know, I said you have to focus on the person spec, right? But there are some things that are just always positive. So commitment, perseverance, resilience, collaboration, ability to, you know, the classic, I work well both as a team and as an individual. And, you know, I am a hard-working, reliable individual. These are the kind of cliches that we always see on 90% of CVs. I would never write them in that way, but those things are certainly useful if you write them in a more compelling way and you give examples. So yeah, in the vast majority of cases, things like collaboration are going to be highly beneficial.
And what about the scenario where, for example, again, it's related to job experience and accomplishments, I start again, and achievements?
Yeah.
Is there an inherent danger, for example, that somebody gives the impression to the interviewer or the client organization in their CV that they are too results focused and they kind of ignore processes?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's also the danger of potentially sounding arrogant. Is that what you're thinking as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I was doing a CV for someone just at the weekend, actually, and they were saying, I don't want to sound like I'm bigging myself up too much, you know. And I always, in response to that, I always say, you should never speak the way you do on your CV, just in general life, okay? The person who bangs on about themselves all the time, nobody really wants to listen to. So I think, first of all, you have to get yourself into the mindset that writing a CV and giving interview answers are unique forms of communication, and it's nothing like the way you would communicate, even in business generally, even comparing a normal meeting to an interview. They're just totally different. So you have to communicate differently. A CV and an interview are two occasions where talking about yourself and being positive about yourself are absolutely required. They are essential to getting selected. So I would always want to, you know, make that clear first. Does it make you look too results focused? Not unless you do it at the exclusion of other things. So maybe, you know, a good example would be if you're focused on profit over other things, right? A business has multiple stakeholders, okay? The general public is usually a stakeholder to most businesses. The environment is a stakeholder for most businesses. So certainly you wouldn't want to give the impression that you cared about profit more than human life. You wouldn't want to give the impression that you cared about profit more than the environment. They're extreme examples, but getting business results whilst also having integrity and being fair to stakeholders, you know, you can find a way of saying that, basically. So yeah, possibly that's a danger, and you would have to make that clear in the way you communicate about yourself.
Yeah, of course. This has been a great conversation today, Graeme. So I'd like to thank you for appearing on the GIFT show today.
It's been a pleasure, John.
And what I've taken away from today's conversation is, firstly, in terms of the length of your CV, 2 to 3 pages is sufficient. If you're a person who's applying for an academic role, perhaps you're an architect or you publish books, you're entitled to, on the 3rd page of your CV, to outline your academic publications, what jobs you've worked on as an architect, for example. That gives you credibility in your sector. Secondly, in terms of a CV, try to give the impression that you are a rounded professional person who's looking to go to the next stage in your career. So there's no one size fits all, I think. You have to think in terms of the job you're applying for and what the key skills in that job are. And you have to give the impression on your CV that you have the skills developed already to apply for that job. So there's no one size fits all, but think in terms of collaboration, but also results and what you have been involved with and what you've achieved. And thirdly, in terms of interests and hobbies, if you are a person who likes to take a calculated risk by mountain climbing, for example, by all means, put those on your CV if required, because it shows you in your true light as a person. And then finally, in terms of GDPR and the finer details, a person doesn't have to put their nationality, their address, their age on a CV. They're not detailed. You don't necessarily have to tell a interviewer. It's none of their business. Your employer, if you're successful at the interview stage and you take up the job, they may need those details then, but there's no need to put those on your CV. And I think finally, no one size fits all with a CV. Think in terms of the job you're applying for and identify what the key skills and core competencies of that job are. And you have to tailor your CV for each job that you're applying for. So don't have one CV for numerous jobs that you're applying for. Absolutely. It must be fit to the job. Is there anything else you'd like to say before I let you go, Graeme?
I think at the end of the day, the employer tells you what they're looking for. They have the power. They are the ones that select. Give them what they've asked for. Give them detail and examples, and don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. Don't follow the rules. Do what works for you.
Yeah. And on that note, I'll bring today's conversation to a close. Thank you, Graeme.
Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure.